Hey everyone, how you doing? Up right and Hurley here in Korea, and I'm here with the man, the myth, the Kiwi legend, James Gunn, and we're going to talk a little bit about New Zealand because I did a whole episode. I did a full hour almost on Australia. So James hit me up. He said, "Hey, I can talk about New Zealand. I'm a New Zealand lawyer." He's actually the first New Zealand lawyer I've ever met, so it'll be really interesting talking about New Zealand law, how their law is different from American law. Because our system obviously is much different. But we're going to learn a lot about this from James here. So James, could you introduce yourself real quick to everybody? Tell them kind of just generally, without doxing yourself, just who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Andrew. This has been awesome. So yeah, basically, I've sort of been in the industry here for not that long. I came into law late in life, but I've always had that interest. So it's been a really good move. As you say, our constitutional system is very different to America, and the fact we actually do not have a formal written constitution, and there are very few countries like that. Really interesting comparison around the Pacific is the likes of Fiji. They've had 4 different constitutions and 4 coups since 1970. So it kind of demonstrates that it's no guarantee.
Right.
So, yeah. And then, of course, with Australia, the Australians have a constitution. We nearly became part of Australia. And we kind of went, yeah, no, we're good. That was mainly lots of reasons, but mainly was because we weren't that happy about how they treated their Indigenous people, where over here we've got a really good relationship with our Indigenous people. In fact, we've got what I call a Treaty Waitangi, which is actually part of that constitutional makeup, even though it's not formal. So, yeah, and I mean, funnily, having said that, I kind of sort of said, well, we'll leave a window open. And so if you go into the Australian Constitution, you'll actually see New Zealand stated as one of the states. So that would mean that if we decided, hey, we want to be the 7th state of Australia, they have to take us.
So they actually put it in their constitution that you could be a state within Australia.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
But no, we're good. We have very much a relationship, probably like you guys have with Canada, the big brother, little brother. A bit of banter back and forth, but we're brothers. We've fought wars side by side. We're pretty tight, and we have a thing called the Trans-Tasman Agreement, which basically means that Australians can live in New Zealand, New Zealanders can live in Australia. We can go back and forth relatively freely, except at the moment, of course.
I was going to say, except for now, because that's totally shut down now, right? So, if you're just quick question, and one thing I'm going to say though, because you mentioned it, and I want to point this out too, because a lot of people talk about law school, going to law school, becoming a lawyer. I actually went and got my master's and I worked before I went to law school. So everybody literally called me old man in law school, even though I was only 28 years old. But I actually find that the people that end up going later in life or end up going after they've done something else, those people tend to be more successful and more focused and more dedicated because they actually have a vision and a mission of what they want to do with the law versus people who go very, very young and they have no idea what they want to do. They have no idea whether their skills are compatible with being a lawyer, right? They don't know that they have to read and write all the time. They think they're just going to be sitting in court, arguing all the time. So they have a bad vision, and it seems like, once again, you're starting out later, but you seem to be very successful at what you're doing. But let me bring that up. So if you're a Kiwi and, you want to go to Australia right now, is that completely shut down? Is it just the borders are completely closed? You can't go over there, even if you have a house there or a residence there?
Well, they opened up what they call a Trans-Tasman bubble. And so for a little while there, we could travel back and forth. But they've had a bit of a scare in the state of Victoria and New South Wales. So they've sort of put the restrictions back in place. And I've actually got some relatives over there that are stuck over there at the moment. So yeah, that was kind of like the first step to step out of our bubble because we've been quite fortunate. It's been about 5 months since we've had a community case in New Zealand. So it's been really we're quite relatively safe here compared to other countries. Things are going well. And I think you can go to concerts, we can go to rugby matches, full stadiums and stuff like that. So it's kind of, we're sitting in our own little bubble, and a lot of people have thought, well, that's because we locked down early, and there's some merit in that, but it's probably also because we've got a very big moat around us. There's a lot of ocean around us that we're hard to get to, and we can control who comes and goes.
And you're very, except for, with the exception of Auckland, right, and in Christchurch to a certain sense, I mean, the population is very spread out, right? There's not a lot of population density. So, a lot of times when you're seeing these huge spreads, it's in these giant metro centers, you see in New York or in LA, or San Francisco, where it's easy. People are clustered together, it's easy for things to spread very quickly versus, if you're out there kind of just on your farm or way out there, on the South Island, somewhere remote, it's very difficult for you to come in contact with a lot of people. So stuff like contact tracing is actually very effective. When you only come into contact with a very small amount of people.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have contact tracing here, but hardly anyone uses it. The risk is
yeah, that's interesting. So let's circle back to the Constitution part. So when you obviously mentioned the Indigenous Treaty with the Maori, right? I mean, that's been well known, and even I knew about that New Zealand has a much different relationship than Australia, right? Australia kind of has a more paternalistic versus New Zealand, which I think is more cohabitation, right? Which I think is a better model. It seems like it's worked out better for New Zealand. But what are some other protections that are guaranteed to New Zealanders, not just in the Constitution, but by other, let's say, treaties or agreements or other documents that might give some sort of protections to New Zealanders?
We have a lot of what we call conventions, which is, they call it oughtness. So it's just what you ought to do. So if someone sort of steps down the line, you just go, nah. And we had a really interesting case here where there's a guy here called Arthur Taylor. Now, Arthur Taylor's a bad boy. He's a what we call a jailhouse lawyer. He's been convicted 152 times. He's spent about 38 years in prison. He's escaped 12 times, but he's basically taken up the law. And we had a situation where they were trying to pass a bill to restrict prisoner voting rights. And he kind of stepped in and went, yeah, nah. So he took the Attorney General to the High Court, and they issued what was called a declaration of inconsistency to Parliament. And we know the separation of powers and how Parliament and the judiciary very rarely tread on each other's toes. And this was the first time it's ever happened in New Zealand where a declaration of inconsistency was issued by the court. And this was by a dude who was pretty much a bad boy. And, there's plenty of people in the fraternity, the law fraternity, and some were going, shock horror. But secretly, there were some other lawyers sitting there going, yes,
Yes.
And I'm sure Arthur had a lot of help in the background. So that was kind of one of those little, the government was starting to step outside. They weren't staying in their lane and they're starting to step outside. We've got the Bill of Rights here, a Bill of Rights legislation that's heavily leaned on, even though it's not superior law and Parliament can override it.
So Parliament can actually override your Bill of Rights. So anything that's in there, they can just pass something through Parliament and that automatically overrides the Bill of Rights.
Theoretically, but they really do it because they know it's not a good look. Probably the biggest safeguard we got here is we can kick them out every 3 years. So Parliament. Yeah, we vote them out. Or vote them back in or vote them out. And I mean, our current Parliament, that's their second term. They're getting a little bit cocky. There's been a few rumblings. Their ratings are going down, which is not really the media, because the media, probably as you are quite left. They
probably more than here, I imagine. I imagine New Zealand is probably a little bit further left than we are.
Yeah, it's getting that way. And I mean, it's really a case of a Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. She comes across well. But if you sort of look back into her history, just go to YouTube, look up Jacinda, and you'll actually see way back that she was at some rally calling everyone comrade, etc., etc. So you don't see much of that unless you go looking for it. We've had a situation because we're big on farming. That's our agricultural is our economic backbone, and we've got a lot of people in the farming community who are getting really disgruntled. And it was only a couple of months ago they had everyone jumped in their tractors and had this massive protest all around New Zealand, sort of going into on the steps of Parliament, driving into central Auckland, taking over the motorways, and it was kind of finally a signal to the government that you might be overstepping the mark here. So yeah, and that's kind of, Kiwis are pretty cruisy, they're pretty easygoing, but you get them to one point and they go, no. So.
Well, what's funny is you don't hear about that, James, because you're telling me about this huge protest. And I did hear about protests in France. I heard about protests in Germany, but and I've clearly seen pictures of the protests in Sydney. Those are pretty epic. But I haven't seen anything out of New Zealand, and that might be because, hey, we don't cover New Zealand as closely in America, right? Major news sources don't cover New Zealand as closely. But from our standpoint as an American, when I looked at it, everyone's saying, oh, New Zealand is this perfect place. Everyone's like, we're going to move to New Zealand. They have no COVID. Let's all go there. Let's all relocate to New Zealand, but you don't see that, hey, there are people that are unhappy there. There's kind of unrest. You kind of just see the rosy side, and a lot of Americans, especially people on the American left, they just look at these jurisdictions and they say, oh, look at how perfect they are. But they don't see that there are, a number of people who are, hey, unhappy with it. And one thing I want to note, because this is a little bit of education for Americans on New Zealand, and you told me this before the show, and I thought this was fascinating. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember you saying that New Zealand does not have an upper house and a lower house of parliament. They just have one parliamentary body, correct? And the one parliamentary body through a coalition would elects the prime minister, correct? That's the governmental form.
Correct. They used to have a legislative council, but they abolished that back in about 1951. Okay. And essentially, probably the reason they did that was fairly pragmatic, because they weren't that effective.
Right.
They pretty much just rubber stamped whatever the lower house put through. So I think they actually put in what they called a suicide squad. So the people who are appointed were actually appointed after the 1950 election to actually disband that legislative council. So that is gone. We also run under a system here called MMP, mixed member proportional. And that was kind of brought in to give the smaller parties a little bit of a voice. But effectively what's happened is when they make coalition governments with other parties involved, right at the beginning, there's a lot of horse trading going on. Mm-hmm. So they kind of like someone who's holding that balance of which of the bigger parties will come in. They'll do a lot of horse trading to actually become part of that coalition government rather than the other. So what you essentially see is the tail wagging the dog.
Right.
So the smaller parties have a hell of a lot more influence than they should. Even though they should have some, it seems that that's the way the system works.
They're the ones that decide. They're the ones that decide whether it's a majority or not. Because let's say the majority requires 100, and you have two parties that are at 90 and 90. Well, if you have a party that's at 15, then that party has a disproportionate amount of power, because they're the ones who are able to swing it, right? So, what are some of the smaller parties in New Zealand that have a disproportionate power? Can you just think of some off
the Greens?
That's not surprising.
Yeah, no surprise there. Up until recently, we had a party called New Zealand First, and that was run by a guy called Winston Peters, and he was a bit of a character, and he was a real horse trader, and he's basically jumped into bed back and forth over the years with one government or the other in order to form a government, and as a result, he's got the plum jobs. He's got a lot of his policies pumped through, even though he was very much a minority party. And that's the kind of the tail wagging the dog scenario we got going on here. Right. And that's really interesting, because once again, I think people, when they think about government, they just kind of focus too much on the prime minister, and they focus a lot on the president or the prime minister. I mean, here in the United States, people focus a lot on Trump when Trump was president. Now it's all about Biden, right? But they don't realize that a lot of the power lies within Congress. A lot of the power relies within Parliament, in your case in New Zealand, right? And that's where a lot of the horse trading goes on. And that's where a lot of the power, the secret power resides, right? The deals get done, the meat gets made. Right now in the United States, we have a huge bill that's being passed, the
infrastructure bill, but the irony is only 9% of it is infrastructure. The majority of it is pork. Is stuff we call it pork. Is this stuff that these special interests put into the bill because they're trying to get consensus, and as they're trying to get consensus, they slip a little bit more and slip a little bit more in horse trade and pork and all this stuff. So it becomes something that's completely ridiculous. So let's one thing I'm really, and I started talking about this and I really want to get into it is, how things have been over the last year in New Zealand, because, you mentioned it, that obviously you guys are locked down right now. Did you guys have compulsory masking? Is vaccine passports looking like they're a thing that's on the radar for you guys? Are jobs requiring compulsory vaccination? Sort of what's the landscape regarding the pandemic and those restrictions?
Well, this is the thing, Andrew, because we've got because of the way our parliament's designed, they can actually pass laws very quickly.
Okay.
So, and I mean, one of the Bill of Rights things is you're not actually obliged to take any medical treatment. So what's happening now is the government have turned around and put through legislation saying that if you're a border worker, you need to be vaccinated, otherwise you don't have a job, or at least not a frontline job. So that's caused quite a stir. Way back when we first went into lockdown, the piece of legislation they used to enact the lockdown was Section 70 of the Health Act, I think. And then they had a guy here called Andrew Borrowdale who actually went and took them to court and said this is lockdown as illegal because you're interpreting that piece of legislation too broadly. So essentially what came of that was, yes, the first 9 days of lockdown was illegal, but it was necessary. And of course, they went straight in and patched the legislation so they could actually keep the lockdown going.
Right. So they just quickly passed a law. So even though it was illegal, they just said, oh, yeah, it was illegal. They pretty much paid no penalty for it. There was no repercussions for that 9 days of illegal. It was just, okay, we're admitting it was illegal, but we're gonna allow it to happen because it already happened, and we're going to pass a new law quickly to make it legitimate.
Yeah, and I mean that's the whole thing about having this one level of House of Representatives, and that's it. And depending on which side of the fence you sit on, you can see that as a good thing or a bad thing, that they can actually get under emergency quite quickly.
Does the Prime Minister have a veto or anything? Is there any sort of like executive level where there's like a veto or any sort of ability for them to stop legislation?
No. The only way you can stop legislation is sure the opposition parties can put their hands up and protest, but at the end of the day, it's parliamentary supremacy. They just push it through.
So that's a real danger.
It is.
Because you have only one. You really have one party, one system that's kind of with no checks, right? In the American system, we have such strong checks and balances with executive, legislative, judiciary, and they all really do check each other. Like in reality, sometimes it's weaker than other times, but there are checks that can come through. But it sounds like the system is set up to have very little checks, other than forming a coalition.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have a system where all bills that go through Parliament go for what they call regal authority, but basically we have our Governor General, because we're a Westminster-style system, who's our Queen's representative, who signs it off. But they never question anything that goes through. It's just... That's a joke.
I've heard about that one from Canada and from a lot of the other colonies. Australia technically I think still has it too. It's like the Queen is never going to object to it. And from what I've heard from Canadian lawyers, like if they did that, it would cause such a stir that they probably would never do that. It would only be in like a very, very, very extraordinary circumstance, probably like a war circumstance, which frankly we're not probably going to be likely to get into anytime soon.
Yeah, and I mean the other check we have is this concept of oughtness. And even though it's not a law, it's just this convention about what people ought to do and what is fair game, what is cricket, if you like. And very rarely do people step away from that. And like I say, we Kiwis are pretty cruisy. We get on with everyone. We're happy-go-lucky. But, if you cross that line, it's just like, yeah, we'll let you know.
You said elections are every 3 years. So does that mean the whole body is up for election every 3 years? Everybody is up for election every 3 years at the exact same time?
Yes.
Okay, so that is a lot of pressure. I will say, the 4-year cycle seems like it's fast in the United States. So, I mean, a 3-year cycle, I mean, and politicians here, pretty much the joke is that they start running for office as soon as they get into office again, So, I can only imagine the 3-year cycle. It is pretty quick. Is there any ability to have a recall election or a special election if people are really, really unhappy with things that are going on? Any ability for like a special election?
Well, only the government of the day can call it.
Mm.
And it's happened before. Back in, I think it's the 70s, we had Rob Muldoon was our PM at the time, and he called a special election. And interestingly, he looks like he'd had a few refreshments prior to making the call. So, whether that was kosher or not, I don't know. But that's kind of what happened. But it's very rare. Very rare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but it's again, it's just the difficulty with that MMP system is you can actually have a main party. They say this is our mandate. They get voted on that mandate, but then they have to do the horse trading with the smaller party to make a coalition government. And sometimes they've got to let those things slide, which is I can't really. I'm not comfortable with that, because if the major party has been voted on a particular mandate and they have to drop it to accommodate a smaller party, it's not right.
Yeah, exactly. They pretty much are compromising what they were elected for the sake of a smaller party, right? Which yeah, exactly. It kind of goes against the whole point, right? There's pros and cons to coalition governments versus a winner takes all system. Like, there are pros and cons to like that system versus the American system, right? Because we obviously, because of our system, we get a huge amount of polarity, right? I think that part of the reason why, maybe Kiwis are a little bit more chill and they're not as comfort, you don't have as much, it's not as explosive as it is here. I mean, to the point where I'm sure that, your people that are upset, they're protesting the actions, but I don't think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think most Kiwis look at each other as sort of like alien. If you were, believed in another party, is there a lot of animosity for people who are of different political parties? I mean, it's just here. It's so bad here. It's just like the Republican Democrat thing. It's like you might as well be aliens, No,
not at all. We just get on. I mean, sort of if your best mate votes for the other party, I mean, there might be a little bit of banter and slinging back and forth, but no, it certainly doesn't damage any of the relationships you have with other people. It's just like, okay, you think differently, that's fine.
Right. It's like, that's okay.
So,
and that's been my experience with everybody I met from New Zealand. I don't know many people. I do know 2 people. I have a friend in Auckland. But it seems like pretty laid back, which tends to be pretty good, in general for a society. Now, I wanted to get into the gun thing because, and I know this is a controversial topic. I mean, in the United States, look, whenever I went to Europe, I would have all my European friends making fun of me, like, they call us cowboys, and they pretend we have guns. Just we're coming around with guns on our backs and in our holsters and walking around with cowboy hats, But I grew up hunting and fishing. I was very pragmatic with use. I went to a, safety course when I was a kid. I went to, I took my concealed weapons license, learned all the safety, procedures for that. So I've always taken it very seriously. I've come from a family that's done that for decades, for years. And it really made me appreciate, number one, the safety aspect, but number two, hey, look, putting food on the table, this was something that our ancestors had to do. They didn't have an option. They didn't have a supermarket. They had to go out there and they had to hunt their food. They had to bring it back and provide it for their families, or they might starve, So for me, it was more of it wasn't something like a yeehaw cowboy thing. It had more of a history. It had more of a background. So, I come from it from the point of, there are legitimate uses for weapons, and I think, the fact that the United States has it in their constitution is great. But other countries have some of these same backgrounds. And New Zealand being a very sparsely populated island, there's lots of farmers. Same with Australia in certain parts. I could see similarities of why people might want or need a gun, right? Because there's things they need to take care of,
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. When New Zealand is sparsely populated, hunting is a huge pastime here. And we've got the situation in New Zealand is it's a lot of animals were brought in early, pigs, deer, goats, rabbits, possums, and they're just pests. And I mean, someone made the joke that if you're driving in New Zealand and you see something fluffy animal on the road, you're obliged to run it over because it's likely to be a pest.
Right.
And so yeah, and I mean, like I've got a 22 that would take my son out rabbit shooting with, and we have a great time. And of course, I'm coming from farming stock, so those people have a real understanding of the need for firearms for hunting and pest control. But over the last couple of generations in New Zealand, I mean, once upon a time, everyone had a connection here to a farm. My uncle had a farm, or my cousin had a farm. But over the last couple of generations, there's been a bit of a divide happening between the city and the country. So there's a lot of people in the city who do not understand the need for firearms out of town, and so they've got a little bit of political clout. And of course, when we had a situation with the Christchurch mosque shooting, everyone just lost their head. And I mean, it was a tragic thing to happen, and it was really awful. But there was some irony around the fact that the shooter, was actually from Australia, obtained everything legitimately. He had firearms license. He bought the guns. Everything was kosher as far as the way he obtained the weapons. But he was still a nut bar, and he went through and shot up the place. But it was kind of the catalyst for our very left-leaning woke government to hammer down as far as gun control and ownership and the types of guns we can own.
Right. So so what they did was they didn't do the Australia route, because Australia, my understanding is they pretty much went with a confiscation route, except for some farmers can have an exemption to have firearms. So are you saying in New Zealand what they did was they kind of limited the types of firearms you can have, and what did they just increase the licensing standards or something else?
Yeah, pretty much what they said was semi-automatics are out, except for 22 caliber and some shotguns, because duck shooting is a big thing here. But even then, they sort of reduced the amount of your magazine sizes, etc. So magazine sizes were all reduced. But pretty much anything that was semi-automatic that wasn't a 22 or shotgun was game, and they had this gun buyback scheme.
Which is the whole scheme, and I'm moving my chair here because it's sinking. But which was the whole scheme where they essentially pay you to get your gun back.
Yeah, you buy back, and that was a bit of a fail, because I think the figures I heard was they got 60,000 guns, but they reckon there was probably close to 200,000 out there. So there's still plenty out there.
So you think that people still just privately kept their guns and were like, look, I'm just not giving you back this gun. And the government wasn't coming door to door, knocking on your door, checking to see what you got, right?
Yeah. And I think it cost twice as much to run the scheme than they actually paid out to gun owners to compensate for their firearms that they handed in. So yeah, whether the people are hanging onto guns just because I'm not going to speculate why. But of course, it also means that it's only the law-abiding citizens that handed in their firearms.
Yeah, it changes the dynamic when you get, now you have people that whenever you get in these schemes, you kind of make people that were previously law-abiding citizens, you've now made them into criminals, right? So now they're, if they're caught with these guns, they're now a criminal, right? Whereas they weren't before, and they weren't really doing any harm, and everything was fine until this one, crazy guy did something that was horrible. And like I said, everybody agrees it was horrible, but once again, my sort of thing to everybody is that, horrible people are going to do horrible things with the tools they have at hand, right? And I point to Europe a lot of times, and I say Europe, a lot of them have no firearms at all in Europe, right? But there's still, bus attacks, stabbings, bombings. There's other things that go on in Europe all the time. In fact, there's still shootings in places like France, that have very few. I mean, very few citizens own guns in France, right? But there's still shootings that happen in France, right? There's still things that happened. I had a friend who was at who was going to go to the Bataclan club in Paris, but she actually was feeling tired, so she went home and slept. Her friend who went with her was shot 13 times and went into a coma. you know, and she would have probably been dead if she went, but she just slept it off and went. But, you know, it's like Paris. I mean, guns are completely taboo, right? Completely taboo. So, you know, it's not going to necessarily avoid these events, you know, unfortunately, you know, because these people are out there. So it's unfortunate for gun owners because I think they're deeply misunderstood. And I think they're portrayed in a way that's unfortunately very negative in most countries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you know, it's like you said, there are legitimate uses for firearms, and particularly in countries like New Zealand.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's like our police don't normally carry firearms on them. They might have one lock up in the car and that type of thing, but no, they're normally not armed.
Because they don't need them, right? I mean, 90% of interactions, you don't need a firearm. And look, I can agree with that perspective. I mean, I think for a lot of, especially in New Zealand, a lot of the places, you don't really need, you know, firearms to engage in the police work, right? And it also changes your tact as a police officer because you're not going to use that force to try to compel somebody to do something, right? You know, to say, I've got a gun on you, so do this.
Yeah. I mean, the technology,
you know, which is, it escalates the situation to 11. And exactly. And once again, that's a very effective technology. You know, I mean, it's not fun to be tased if you've ever been hit by a taser. But James, I'm going to wrap this up. But oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's cool. No, we're good. So I think we covered everything.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I'd love to have you back on. You know, I had an Australian reach out to me as well, so maybe we'll one day do like an Australia versus New Zealand panel here. You know, but thank you so much because. Yeah, it's just, you know, a lot of people don't understand that around the world, and I have a very, you know, international audience, but around the world, the laws are very different, right? And they have very different systems. And so lawyers, you know, just because I'm a lawyer in the United States doesn't mean that I understand New Zealand law or Australian law or, you know, and I'm here in Korea, I don't know Korean law, you know. And certainly I haven't taken these bar exams. So it's always good to get that perspective. So once again, James, thank you so much for your help. And thank you so much for telling us all about New Zealand. Not Australia. Not Australia.
Yeah, good save.
Exactly.
Thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, and I'd love to come back on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, guys. And please, you know, if you like this, drop a comment, say thank you to James, and we will be back very soon.